Hello, we are working on Chapter 6 this evening, and Chapter 6 furthers our study of the active record component that's built into the Rails framework. And apparently we're doing the advanced stuff now because the first stuff was maybe more basic than this. But notice that what we're doing, the kind of little byline or tagline for the chapter is enhancing your models. So we're going to be doing some stuff at the prompt, and then we're going to be doing some stuff with our code. So it's going to be kind of a combination of the two techniques that we're seeing here. And one thing that they try to point out right off the bat is the fact that we are using methods that are intrinsically built into the ActiveRecord Superclass for this language. So a lot of the methods are just built in to that abstraction tool. So whenever we're building data models, we're usually extending active record. But we also have the capabilities, because most of these things are going to exist as code within our applications, that we can customize them and do our own things to them as well, and kind of leverage those tools to make it do basically a little bit more than what normally would happen, depending on the logic of your application. All right. So whenever you see this terminology here, we are basically creating, in this case, we're going to be creating a user class that's going to be representative of a data model and data within our database. And it will extend the capabilities of active record, which is what that terminology indicates. And I think you guys are already familiar with that as a concept, so I don't think it's too difficult. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to start digging in to some of these files and making alterations. And we have a lot of little tools that we have to add to our application, a lot of little features that we have to add in order to get certain things to happen correctly. You know, we did learn that some things can be automatically done in this infrastructure. We also will be learning that, you know, the nuances, the detail is where your coding skills come in, right? And what dictates those needs is really kind of the needs of whatever you're doing. So, and that for me, as I teach these courses, really kind of becomes one of the larger challenges for students that maybe haven't gone through like the project management class, for example, or actually worked on real life projects, is you have these tools that do these wonderful things automatically for you. But then ultimately you do have to apply it to a real world situation. And every real world situation has its nuance that requires certain types of solutions and logic. So logic that might apply to one situation that doesn't apply to a different one. However, there is still, and the reason these frameworks exist, a strong propensity to create things that are similar between applications, because we kind of get used to the way things flow technologically. All right, let's go ahead and talk about our first change here. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to see is going to be listed like listing 6.1. The author will give you a location in the application folder structure where the file exists. So either the file already exists and we need to edit it, or the file will need to be created. And that will always be indicated right here in the listings. So like this part of it indicates which file we're dealing with. The thing that's kind of interesting is there's also links to GitHub. All right, now I don't know if you guys have clicked these yet or not, and I'm hoping that you've been brave and that you have. And I'm going to go ahead and launch that, and you're going to see that what this is going to do is it's going to take you to the author's GitHub repository where the code already exists. Okay, so the disclaimer though is this code has changed over time. So what you get at GitHub might not be exactly right. However, the one nice thing about working with this interface is the copy and paste and highlighting, I think, is a lot cleaner if you're going from here directly to a text editor. And it's also kind of a good place to go and look and just double check your work. Sometimes the stuff that's in the book is a little different than what you see on GitHub. In this case, do you guys notice that there's a difference in syntax even right here? There is, right? There's a different approach on the left, which is what's on GitHub. Now then you have to start being really careful about looking at other things. Excuse me. I usually try to pause when I sneeze. Sorry, video people. I was like, where's the mouse? Where's the mouse? Just couldn't get it fast enough. And then I want you to look really carefully at this. Created 9 years ago. So there's a good chance that things have changed a little bit since then. The wonderful thing is there is a lot of backwards compatibility here. So usually, there's one better way to do things. But often, an older approach isn't necessarily bad or not going to work. It might be syntactically a little bit different. For the most part, I can tell you from my experience working with the book, we're going to stick with what's in the book or what is auto-generated. I do sometimes have students coming here and pulling in this code. And there's the fascinating thing about GitHub, of course, is it's kind of like an open source kind of free-for-all in a sense, right, with comments. So you see, like, there's one person here that commented on March 7th of 2017. I'm not really sure what the comment refers to because the code still looks the same. Was there an error here somewhere, or what is the guy? Yeah, the spacing's different. No, the content is basically the same as what's above, so I'm not really sure what the actual difference is here or why the guy posted it. But you want to take that with a grain of salt. Now, the other thing that you should notice at GitHub, right, here's the code. You guys notice this other tab, right, revisions, and you should click on that and then notice that hypothetically this is a revision. Once again, I'm not seeing the difference, but I guess I'm not really studying it all that close. And then you can also see up here that people have been tweaking it over time. So it's kind of interesting sometimes to come out here to GitHub and take a look at this stuff. Because the whole nature of GitHub, the fact that it's open source, if you have an account here that you do not pay for, you use one of the free accounts, anybody can see your stuff. I don't know if you guys know that. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. If I was working professionally on a project, especially proprietary software, first of all, I probably wouldn't put it on GitHub. Well, I'd probably use a different service, frankly. But I would certainly pay and have my stuff privatized because I don't want people looking at work in progress when it's not ready. But the impact of GitHub, folks, don't mistake how important this service is. Microsoft's in the process of purchasing them right now. I think we talked about this last week, to the tunes of billions of dollars for this service. I forget how many users they have worldwide, but it's in the millions. And I think they've had a 20% jump in subscribership in the past year alone. So it really actually is a cool place to come to share your work. And for those of you going out into the field looking for work, I always advise my students that you should, if you write a lot of code, software students and web students, post your stuff out here, the stuff you want to share. Because a lot of employers, if you don't have a GitHub account where you share your code, they kind of don't think of you as real when you're a coder. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon, actually. So GitHub and having a GitHub account is kind of like almost the equivalent of like a business card or a website. And students are like, yeah, but the homework we do is like really dumb and right? But regardless of that fact, it still shows that you did something. It still shows that you are able to get a GitHub account and that you did some PHP, you did some HTML, you did some Ruby on Rails. And the other reason why people use these services is why? Because their code is stored in the cloud and they never lose it. All right, so let's jump back over then to the book, and we are going to stick with what's in the book for right now, but I am telling you that we will want to pull out our text editors at this point and start doing some of this work. So uh, in my command prompt, I do have a prompt up on the screen. I am in my blog folder where we're going to be doing our work. So you want to navigate to that folder. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a file folder window. And I am also going to navigate to where I'm storing my work. And actually, I'm already going to the wrong spot. It's the root of my C drive. And here's my application. At this point, I'm going to look at the folder location. So app models article RB. So app models article RB. And as I do for most of my coding classes, I'm probably going to stick with using Notepad++, unless somebody has some inclination that I use something else. I don't have a lot of stuff loaded on this machine, frankly. I was just thinking maybe I should do Visual Studio Code, but I just had the recollection, you know what, I don't even have it loaded up, so not a big deal. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a comparison here between what we have in the book and then what we have in the actual application. And I want you to notice a significant change already between what we're seeing in the book and what we're seeing automatically generated by the Rails framework. And what's the big difference that you guys see first and foremost? Bingo. Right? And that's a pretty significant change from Rails version 4 to Rails version 5. Okay, now in terms of like the other code that we're going to write, things will still be fine. The thing that we do not want to change, we do not want to change that first line of our code to match what's in the book. If the tool automatically generated this, this is what we're leaving in there. So as long as you guys have that part clear, we should be okay. The other thing that I want you to notice is that line 2, per the earlier work that we did a few chapters back, I forget if it was chapter 3 or 4 or whatever it was, where we put in that validation code, and notice it says validates presence of title, comma, body. And in the book, we have it separated on 2 lines. Let's take a vote. Shall we change it to what's in the book, or can we leave it alone?
Leave it alone.
Yeah, why touch it? It worked, right? Could I switch it to what's in the book? Sure. But all you're seeing here is that the one that we already have in our code is the shorthand method. That works just fine. So in fact, if I had other fields where I needed to make sure that there was something in the field, you know, from a validation standpoint, so it's just not empty, I can just comma append it to the list, or I could make a longhand list like what you see in the book. So that part I'm not going to touch. But I do see that we are adding actually a method in here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some lines in my text file to accommodate for that. And yes, I'm kind of trying to do the side-by-side thing here as best I can. So I'm going to add some blank lines, and then I'm going to add the code that we see in the book. So please do the same if you haven't done so already. Indent 2 spaces. Then I want you to notice how we're typing this information in. And what's with that pound sign? What do we call that? Yeah, well, when we're working with this technology, when you see a pound sign followed by curly brackets, we always call it a hash for whatever reason. And you're probably used to the concept of like a hashtag, which really refers to that pound sign. I'm sorry for you, Nathan. You know that got recorded, by the way. Okay, so It's going to be on YouTube tomorrow. So there's actually been much worse in my classes, actually. That's okay. I put it all out there because it's the real deal. All right. So once you've made that change, please go ahead and save it. But what we're indicating here is that we're going to have defined inside of the article class a method called long title, long underscore title. And all that's going to do is it's going to grab the title from whatever current object we're working with. It's going to grab the published at date from whatever article we're currently working with, and it's going to inject it into a string. So the fact that we see the quotes here means we're really building a string, right? What are we putting in it? Well, we're not quite sure. We're putting in placeholders. And in this format, in order to extract the information from whatever object we're working on, it's going to grab whatever the active title is, whatever the active published at date is. It's going to put a space, a dash, and a space in between them, concatenate them together basically as one string. And so when I say article dot long underscore title, it will take those two pieces of information and put them up on the screen for me. Pretty simplistic, really, but powerful nonetheless. So Control S to save that file. So that change has now been made. At our prompt, we're going to go ahead and launch the Rails console. So please go ahead and do that. Give it a second to go into interactive Ruby mode. And the next task that we have, as you can see, is that we are going to create a new article. And trying to do my arrangement here so we can see both clearly. So let's go ahead and mimic the command. And notice here we're dealing directly with the capital A version, which is directly with the model. And we're going to issue the create command. It's a dot, not a comma. And then we're going to type in the command just like we see it. So I'm going to take my time here and type this in. You should do the same. So article title, comma separated fields. We're going to do our published at. We'll just do a date dot today. Now, I don't know if you guys caught what I just did, but I haven't finished my command quite yet, and I pressed enter. Probably shouldn't have done that. But you notice how the prompt changed and how there's a little asterisk right there? It recognizes that I'm not done yet. Isn't that fascinating? So I'm going to go ahead, and then what you really should ask yourself is why? Why wouldn't it just go ahead and do that? Maybe it has something to do with our validation, because what else is required? Okay, so maybe that's giving you a little bit of a clue here. So their text is models need to relate to each other in the real world, comma, dot, 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 dot. Close that, and now I'm going to press enter. Now it actually works. Okay, so for as accidental as you thought I was doing that, I actually demonstrated a technique here. If it required only the title, right, validates presence of title, and I just put in title and published at, it would have took that and wrote the record. But because it was still missing a piece, it kept the prompt open. Isn't that fascinating? Right? It is. It is actually pretty advanced. But it's showing you that it's interacting with the text file that we just updated. Yeah. Even though that's a static file, and now we're working at the prompt. Okay, so that's a pretty critical thing. So we created a new article, and now we're going to run that command that you see next, which is article.last, which is the one we just created. And now we're going to trigger the method that's built into it, which is called long title. That's the one that we defined manually. And as you look, notice what it did. It grabbed the title of the article, advanced active record, space, dash, space, and then the date today. Now, hopefully you guys got the same result up on the screen. Any issues? You guys are all good? All right. But it does show you that the changes that we made to the text file, right, can be activated at the command prompt, even the custom code that we wrote. It's really, for me, kind of the best description here, really. All right. I have a little tidbit here that you guys might want to read through, talking about this concept of what they call fat models. And I'll let you, I could go like on this tangent for a while, so I'm not going to, but I do suggest that you read that little bit. It has to do with the whole concept of keeping things dry. The other thing is you want to be really careful about how you build your data models, just like how you build your database tables. Really, there's the logic that you use is similar for both. Sometimes people do build database content that is, frankly, unnecessary, right? Or they make their database do things that, do we really need the database to do that? For example, you can do calculations in a database, or you can create stored procedures in a database, and in some cases, they're logical things to do. Okay. In other cases, it's illogical to burden your database with that work when the client can do the work. And remember, we have the web browser, so the web browser has JavaScript built in, and we can do a lot of work with JavaScript. And then on top of it all, we now have this Ruby on Rails framework, which can also do some of the work for us too, really taking some of the burden off the database. And this kind of goes back to our earlier talk now that I think about it. All right, but let's move on with the concepts here and move on to a real key database piece, which is associations, right? And associations in a database, folks, are really what make a database, a relational database, what it is. A flat file, or an Excel table, if you will, right, where you have rows and columns, and each column represents a data attribute, if you want to compare it to a model, and then each row represents information about a specific entity being entered into that database table, is wonderful. And yes, a single table really is, for all intents and purposes, a database, right? That would be a flat file, right? And it can be represented many different ways. And those flat files really are the core component of any database, those tables, rows and columns. But what really makes a database is realizing where we have overlaps in information, and that it is illogical to take like one individual record in a table and try to add so many columns of data to it that really shouldn't be there. You make the table, yeah, I mean, it makes it inefficient. And it's not just about the scrolling to the right. It's also about, do I need to, for example, to include my grades as a student in my personal information record? Well, it depends on, well, yeah, I suppose. But in other words, it makes much more sense if I took my personal information, like my address, phone number, email address, age, social security number, and have that in one table. And then have a separate table that would indicate what classes I've registered for, what my grades are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really taking the information and separating it into separate tables that are linked together by fields. So that if I'm a student with a student ID number, and then I register for classes, we would have a separate table for registration where my student ID number would appear next to the ID numbers of the classes I signed up for. And that's exactly how databases work. And you guys hypothetically know this already, but those associations are what drive databases. There's many different kinds of associations, okay? So let's take a look at their example here, where they talk about how we have an articles database, and you can see some of the fields from the articles table, including the ID of the article, the title of the article, and the body text. Of course, we know there's other fields, but those are some of the key ones. And then in a blog, right, when you post an article as a blog entry, one thing that makes a blog kind of unique is the ability for people to make comments on it, right? And you see that on a lot of newspaper sites, which shows you that a lot of newspaper sites are really built on top of blogging engines, right? And why is like WordPress like the big CMS, right? Because the way that concept operates is all based off of that interactivity of the commenting engine. Now, in order to be able to, of course, make comments, it wouldn't make sense to take all the comments that users might make on your blog article and store them in the same table as the article itself. It makes no sense at all. So what you do instead is you create a separate table for comments. That, in turn, will have its own ID column. And then we would link whatever comments are being generated to the article that they're affecting. So if somebody saw my Rails Pub Night article, which is now deleted, and wanted to comment about how wonderful an idea that is, right? That they would then attach that article ID in that table. So really the only link between the comment and that article is that article ID. Now, if you think about how that would work, if I have one article, I could have many comments, right? So you guys remember the whole concept in databases of the types of relationships that you have between tables. You have tables that will have what they call a one-to-many relationship, and this would be one of them, right? So with one article, I could have many comments. So in other words, many unique comments with their own unique IDs, but those comments would have one article they're linking back to. The relationship is called one-to-many. Now, what's fascinating about that is the way Ruby handles these connections. Okay, so we get into this concept now of foreign keys and defining those relationships. And I want to basically show you this table. So first of all, we remember that the way that this language works with the data models is it automatically articulates plurality in terms of how we instantiate things. So if the model is called article, the table is called articles. And then automatically, and you guys need to think about this, automatically the ID link then becomes the singular version of the table name with ID appended to it. So article, singular, plural is articles. Foreign key, singular, article, lowercase. Person, that's the model. Table is people. That always gets people. Because you don't think of like people as being the plural of person, but that's what it is. And therefore the foreign key is back to the singular, notice, back to person ID. So when you see that, that's one of those that can throw you off. So I'm always kind of careful about what I name things because I'm not always a huge fan of this like automatically renaming. But this is what the engine does. So friend, friends, friend, lowercase. Category, categories, IES. Category, singular, lowercase. And then books, book, and book. So you get kind of that idea. And that does happen automatically. And yes, there's a singular thing. And believe it or not, folks, what's interesting about that is there's somewhere in the engine that does that automatically. I don't know who thought of that and went to the trouble of creating it, but it is a convention you want to be aware of as you're working. Now, the interesting thing is, one of the beauties of working with this technology is that once you have those links between your tables and you've defined them in a one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many type of relationship, and the link is forged, you then all of a sudden have leveraged a different tool, which is wonderful, and that is to see results such as the one you have on the screen right now. So I would be able to issue a command in my code or from the prompt that would say article.comment. So I would load the article into memory, I would type article.comments, and that one command traverses both data models, finds the connection, and pulls in all the comments that are related to that article. With that syntax, I want you to think about that in comparison to writing select from where, think of like a SQL statement it would take to do the same work. So you see the beauty of the syntax. And then, if you want to think of other examples, and we're working with the article, methodology. But if I was to, let's say, have a store, right, and I want to pull in the products, or I have a magazine and I want to pull in all the subscribers, that I could do it with a syntax as elegantly simple as that is, from an old school coder's standpoint, that is blow away. Because that's what the database abstraction layer does for you. Yeah, and it's not that it just knows, but it is, we're still going to be building the associations, and that's really what this section's about. So the way that this technology works is we do have to, in some cases, force those connections. And we also have to force the logic of the connection. So in other words, it would be up to us to know that we would have many comments for one article. And then notice the terminology they use here. So if you've learned in the old school approach of doing those relationships, you learn the syntax, one-to-one, one-to-many, right? Many to many. And here's the syntax, or the style of syntax that we use in this language. Like, for example, if it's a one-to-one relationship, we say has one. Now, when it just sits there as a phrase like this in outer space, all on its own, it doesn't really make as much sense, frankly. Or has many, or belongs to, or has and belongs to many. Talk about a weird command, right? But these are the commands to form the association. So take a look at the first example. It says class, message. Okay, so we're dealing with a message. That message has many attachments. So here's the implication there. Message is a table that holds messages. So let's say email message. There's a separate table that holds the attachments that might get attached to a message. How many attachments can you put on a message? Many. So message has many attachments. Now, they came up with this syntax to make it easy to logic through the structure, okay? But that's how we do it in this language. Now, the attachment, from the converse viewpoint, an attachment can't just be sitting in outer space. So with the attachment, we have to enforce referential integrity, if you want to think of it in those terms, by saying that we just can't have an attachment sitting here without it belonging to a message. So an attachment, from the standpoint of the attachment, must be attached to or belongs to a particular message. Otherwise, can it be attached? No. So you see the logic there? And I know that they talk through this in the verbiage there, but I want you to think of it from a common sense standpoint, just like that, which for me was kind of the key to kind of understanding it. All right, so now they're going to start to walk through all the different approaches for doing this. And what we are going to figure out here is we're working up towards building a fully functional blog or CMS kind of structure here. All right. So if we're posting articles and we want to apply comments to those articles, right? And you guys should know this, right? For most systems where you can post comments, first you have to be a user, right? And then another thing that you have to, all users that are on systems, you think of like Facebook or WordPress or whatever, you usually have to have a user profile. So you start to see like how we're building up a structure here. So all of a sudden, we're going to have a comments table, a user table, a profile table. So see how like the application starts to build. And what we're really understanding here is that every time we have a particular type of feature for an entity, that we also have to have a table of data to hold it and store it, so that each individual entity can have a record in that table. Okay, and that terminology is not accidental. Why do we call it an entity relationship diagram? An entity is a great word because it can refer to anything. It can refer to a person, a place, a thing, a financial transaction, whatever. It's an entity. All right. So before we can do this work, well, we need to create our models, right? So we can go into the database and manually create tables, right? Well, you know what? That's not how we're doing it. We're using the power of Rails. But here's the thing. We're at the wrong kind of prompt right now. Yeah, we need to exit out of this prompt. The other thing that you can do is if you want, you could open up a secondary prompt. That's up to you. I'm going to choose to exit. I don't think that anything I've done in here is stored in a variable where I'm worried about losing something in memory, right? Yeah. Right, so I'm going to just go ahead and type exit at the prompt and back to the prompt. At this point, whenever you see this in the book, and you guys should know this, right? If you're working at a Linux machine, or if you're working on a Mac, or you downloaded the same tool that Robert downloaded, which was like the all-in-one setup where you can use prompt if you wish, that you would have a $ prompt. I need to plug in my laptop, obviously, and now that I have power, we're going to go ahead and type in this command. So remember, this is something that we did early on, but now we really see the power of it. Already have an application up and running. We've identified that in order to kind of build our commenting system, we need several different tools, several different models and data structures in order to make it happen. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to type that command. So we're going to generate our user model. And right off the bat, not only are we going to generate that user model, but we're going to set up a couple of columns in the table, one for email and one for password. Okay, so let's go ahead and get that command typed in. You can type it in manually. You can also copy and paste. I'm just going to go ahead and type it. So I'm going to Rails generate model user with a capital U. We're going to set up 2 columns right away. One to store the user email address, one to store their password. I'm not pressing enter quite yet. Keep in mind that automatically Rails will also generate an ID column. And if you remember when it did the articles table, it also creates 2 timestamped columns automatically too, which was the created at and last modified. Those are automatic, right? So aside from those 2 columns, 3 additional columns will be created. You can go ahead and press enter. All right, and you can see the work that it did. So in the database folder, notice that second line, it says create db migrate, and then it's a real long number, which if you look at it really closely is actually today's date with a timestamp. And then notice it says create users. Now, it's in the form of Ruby code. And yes, you know what, folks? You can actually go and look at that. In fact, we're going to do exactly that in the next step if you see that. So let's go ahead and do that. Go to, in your application structure, go to your blog folder, go to database, go to migrations, or migrate, find the create users, Go ahead and open that up in a text editor and take a look inside so that you can see what it did automatically for us. Once again, I want you to notice a little bit of a difference between what's printed in the book and what we're getting on our screen. Line 1, we have active record migration, but notice it appended to the end of it in square brackets. It also indicates version number. So it tells you that there are some changes. We go with what's automatically generated. Don't tweak that. Then inside this defined method called change, we are going to create a table and a loop, right? And then we're going to go ahead and create an email field, that's a string, a password field, that's a string, and the default timestamps, created, modified. Those are automatic. And yes, if I don't want those included, all I have to do is strike line 7. Notice the ID field is not even optional. It's just going to create that anyhow. And you know what? If you guys didn't learn this in your database class, when you're creating database tables, it's always a good idea to have an ID field for a database table, even if you don't use it. If only to index it. You know, it's still a good idea to have it, and that's why it's not really optional. So really what we're doing here is we're looking at this just to verify that it happened, right? And there's no changes that we're making at this point in time at all. Right, this is how it works. Now, the thing that's fascinating about this is just because we type that command, it does not mean it's in the database. The reason it's not is because this file that we're looking at in the text editor is in the database migration folder. It will create this table when we run the command rake db migrate. Okay, you got that? Could we run that command now? Yes, we could. However, we're not. Why? Because we know we're going to build more stuff. So I could build all the stuff I want first and then run the command and add it all to the database at once. And you know what? That's a better way to proceed. Because really what you would do is if you were building this application, you would be sitting down and you would be sketching out on paper or screen or whatever all the different data structures that you need, and you'd plan it out. You'd probably sit there and have a meeting with your database guy, and then you get to the point where you're like, okay, well, this is a clear map of what I need to do. Then I'm going to code it all. Then we're going to migrate it into the database. Then we're going to test it. Okay, so hopefully I haven't talked your ear off too much, but we have one other model that we need to create here, and that's this one. So let's go ahead and type this one in at the prompt. Once again, so we're going to type Rails generate model. This time we're creating a profile for the users. Okay? And then notice the fields that we're going to create. First one is user underscore ID. Why? Because in our database planning, if we actually did it, we'd probably want each user to have a user profile. So that will be an integer. Why? Because that's what the system generates for IDs. We also want to have their name. Well, why are we putting it here and not in the user model? Because all the user model holds is their email address and password. Why? Because that's all that's needed to log in. Interesting, right? We're also going to put in a birthday, which is going to be a date. We're going to have them a spot where they can put in a little bio about themselves, which is going to be in a text format, so it's a little bit longer than a string. Color, I assume that's so you can put in your favorite color. There's not one in here for genders, folks, sorry. But you could write one in if you want. And they're putting in a link for Twitter here, which maybe when they wrote this book, they thought that was the thing that you would do. But probably it should be Facebook, right? And it's probably better that we leave that out altogether. So we're going to create a new model with the columns. User ID, name, birthday, bio, color, and Twitter. Automatically generated, once again, will be 2 timestamps and an ID field. So with the 3 auto-generated ones, and then the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we're going to have a total of 9 columns in that table. All right, go ahead and press enter. All right. Once again, you can see that it created a migration record. It also creates a Ruby file in the models folder that is representative of the data in the table. We can go look at those both. In fact, let's do that. Since we're already in the DB migrate folder, let's look at create profiles. And then notice all the fields. So basically the same thing. It just shows all the columns we're creating. Then the other thing that we want to look at is go to the root of the project, go into the app folder, and then models. And then notice that we also have Ruby files for profile. What's inside of it? Nothing. What's inside of the user file? You can anticipate. Nothing. All right. Now, they don't tell us to do that in the book, but I'm doing it on purpose. Okay. So in the migration folder, we have files, Ruby files, that will run and help us create those tables. Now it's the job that we actually run the migration, and here's where we do our rake command. So we type rake space db migrate. It is critical that you guys understand that when you run this command, whenever you're generating new data models, it creates those migration files, and it does not get written to the database or anything gets created until you run the migrate. And that's like a difficult one to remember at times, especially when you're building things. Now, the output that we got was exactly what we wanted to see. It goes through all the files in the migration folder, and it recognized which ones were added, took the ones that were added, ran the code, and notice created the table users, created the table profiles. So those are now part of our database. If you want to be sure, open up the SQLite browser and take a look. I'm pretty confident that they're there. Okay, so I'm not going to do that. All right. Now we're going to go back to those same files in the models folder. And you know what? You're going to take a look now. And I closed them. So I'm going to take both of these files, and then I'm going to drag them back into my text editor and open them both up. And they didn't change. Some of you may have guessed, okay, well, maybe it's going to change. Nope. This is the part where we add in the features that we want. So we can define our associations between tables here. So the first one we're going to do is for the user class, we are going to add has one profile. And if you think of it from just a logical perspective, right? Every user should really only have one profile, right? So that's why the terminology is kind of nice. And the way I always read it is I say, user has one profile. Makes sense to me. Make sure you do Control S to save it. Okay, don't forget that. And then for profile, we do also have to forge that association on this end. And so we do have to say belongs to user. And once again, Control S to save. They do talk a little bit here about how this is going to lay out in the tables. So in the profiles table, we're going to have this user ID field. Now, the one thing I do want you to notice, though, and this is what I think is fascinating, is that I didn't define user underscore ID anywhere. It recognizes that as the given. Yeah, that's what that table that we looked at above was telling us. Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to think of it. All right, now they want us to go back to the Ruby prompt, of course. And this is one of those situations where, you know, oh, darn it, why did I close the prompt? But I want you to notice the first command that they have you put in here. Assuming you had left your prompt open, it tells you to run this command. And notice what it says. The reload command in the console session to make sure it loads the newly generated models. So one way to take care of that problem is to close the prompt and reopen it. You type in reload. So what it's saying is that it recognizes what folder it's in. It recognizes what models were in memory. And you know what? We changed them. All right, so I'm going to go back to the console here, folks. Or you might opt to run two prompts. And you know what? Another thing that is pretty common too with people doing this kind of work is they'll have one for command prompt, one for Ruby prompt, you know, the Rails console, and one for the web server, 3 separate sessions. You just keep them all open, you know, and yeah, and you know what? And even if you don't have multiple screens, it still works. All right, so Rails console. Now, I don't need to run the reload command, but you know, it doesn't hurt to run it either. So, and yes, the exclamation is required. Yeah, doesn't work without, does it? Yeah. Because you're not just reloading, you're reloading. You're really doing it. All right. So, let's go ahead now and from the prompt, manipulate our new tables. Okay, so here we go. First command says we're going to, in memory, create a user, and we're going to issue the command user create. So let's go ahead and type that in just as we see it. So we're going to type user equals capital U user create. So we're creating a new record in the table. First, we're going to populate the email field. And you know what? I may as well just put in exactly what they have on screen. And I actually ask that you do the same thing. And the reason is, we get later on into these applications, and I start taking your code and testing it. It's helpful for me to have the username and password that I know, if you want to know why. I just answered that, sir. And the password, of course, is a real secure one, secret. Just like that. And then with one press of the key, we now have created our first user for our application. Next, we're going to go ahead and create a profile. So we're going to say profile equals profile dot create, and then in parens, we're going to fill in a couple of those fields. Notice we're not going to put in favorite color, but if you wanted, you could. So the first thing we're going to put in is name. We'll just do exactly what the book's doing, John Doe. And then we're going to type a bio. Oops, get that colon in there. Ruby developer trying to learn Rails. Yeah, we didn't do color, we didn't do Twitter, we didn't do birthday. I forget what else was in there. and that's certainly enough. So go ahead, press. All right, and now here's where we start seeing this rollback thing. Who else got the rollback? Everybody got the rollback? Okay. So something we did here was not correct. Now the question is, what was that? And let's see if we can figure that out. Okay, so first thing I'm looking at nil, right? I want you guys to think before I tell you the answer here. Why can't I just create a profile? There's a reason for it. That's right. When we put in belongs to, we are implying a foreign key relationship. And I did not include a value for the user ID that this is attached to. So therefore, it is not valid and is being rejected. You guys catching that? So this is not a mistake. Okay? And then, of course, you see the command they type next, right? User.profile, and of course it's nil, right? Because we know it didn't work. It said rollback transaction. Okay, so we know it didn't work. So I didn't, really, we didn't have to actually type that. All right, so now watch the next command, and this is the one that is actually kind of crucial here. So user.profile equals profile. Because I know, because this is how my brain thinks, that the one thing you guys could say is this. Well, if I would have included not just, what did we put in? The guy's name and his bio. If I would have also put in user_ID equals 1, right? To match the user we already created, it probably would have worked. Right? That's the thinking. But there's a different approach, and the approach that they're showing you is this one right here, because right now, from the prompt, we have user and we have profile. And notice the syntax, user.profile. It's kind of like we're creating a new thing. We're going to feed the profile that we created into a thing called user.profile. So watch what happens when I press enter here. And then look at the output. By adding to it with .syntax, user.profile, it is basically forging a connection, following that pathway that we'd established to allow it to happen. What it's doing is it's identifying the fact that we have only one user, and here I have a profile, and it's automatically attaching it and putting those two items together. Now, I need to type another command to lock it into place, right? User.save. This now stores that association. And if you had the database tables open, you could look and see the association be forged with that user ID dropping in. Of course, the next command they have us type is user.profile. And now you can see right here, that association was automatically forged. Now, this works right now because how many users do we have? 1. Okay, so you're safe. It would also work if whatever user is stored in user currently is active in memory. So we pulled it up and have it active in memory, and then you could forge the two together. So you got to be careful with this one from that standpoint. But yes, there is an association that's happening here. I'm looking right now for a logical starting point or stopping point, and I'm going to finish this next page. And if you guys have to leave, please please feel free to leave. But I do want to finish page 89. All right. So the next command that they have us type is this: user.create_profile. You guys catching this, the terminology here? All right. I'm creating now a profile for not John Doe, but notice Jane Doe, where I am creating the profile before I'm creating the user. This is kind of an interesting thought, just even in conception, honestly. So now we're doing color. Of course, your favorite color is pink. That's what it tells me to type, so that's what I'm doing. All right. And once again, what's happening? Yeah, I can't write it into the database because it has nothing to attach to. Same as yours. However, it is in memory. Okay, that is in memory. All right. Now they go through this little table here, and you guys can read through this, about some of the different approaches as far as how you type it in and what the resulting action is in terms of what you're doing. And you notice that with create profile, it says returns a new profile object that has been instantiated with attributes and linked to user through a foreign key that has already been saved, which is the part we don't have, right? Because we're implying a new user here. All right, so let's type this, user profile, just like the book. And what's it pulling back? Well, the only one that we have. Right. Is this what you expected to see, though? Okay. Let's try the next command. User yeah, and you know, and here's what's going on here. None of this is going to work. I want you to notice that at the beginning of each one of these lines, there is not the double bracket prompt, but what it's showing you is examples of what the outputs are. So none of these commands are actually going to apply to any of the things we're doing. And that's why we're getting back different output. So these are not commands you actually have to do. These are examples with some sample return values, nothing that applies to us. All right. This is where we're going to stop. Yep, this is where we're going to stop. But I do want you to also read this little table here, which talks about the relationships and how they're forged. So when we come back next time, we're going to kick in right at this spot. And as you can see, really kind of the next major thing that we're going to do is we are going to generate a migration to basically forge those two tables together. All right, folks. Thank you.